The COP29 summit, chaired by the Azerbaijani Minister Mukhtar Babayev, culminated in a contentious adoption of a new collective qualified goal, an NCQG, on climate finance, $300 billion annually by 2035. Despite this agreement, sharp criticism has dominated the proceedings, highlighting profound dissatisfaction from developing countries and concerns about the inadequacy of the pledge. The financial goal, the $300 billion annually pledged by developed nations, aims to help poorer countries address climate change impacts and transition to greener energy. The target replaces the previous $100 billion per year, first promised in 2020, but only met in 2022. It expires in 2025. So the broader goal includes mobilizing $1.3 trillion annually, largely from private sources. The agreement reflects ongoing debates about the moral and financial responsibility of industrialized nations to poorer nations, the responsibility for these industrialized nations whose historic emissions have significantly driven climate change. And while industrialized nations agree to lead the contributions, developing nations like China and oil-rich Gulf states were merely encouraged to contribute voluntarily, perpetuating long-standing tensions over burden sharing. Talks extended past the scheduled conclusion, with last-minute deals struck after 24-hour extensions, and delegates from poorer nations walked out at one point, citing exclusion and dissatisfaction with watered-down terms. India's representative, Chandni Raina, lambasted the agreement as abysmally poor, saying this document is little more than an optical illusion. And Sierra Leone's Jiwa Abdulli described the deal as demonstrating a lack of goodwill, while Nigeria's Nkrutka Makekwe called it an outright insult. Experts, including Mohammed Adaw of PowerShift Africa, argued the sum fell short of the $390 billion that economists had identified as necessary to meet global warming challenges. Vulnerable nations such as the Marshall Islands expressed mixed feelings, with climate envoy Tina Steg saying it isn't nearly enough, but it's a start. Sabine Minenga from Bread for the World called the result a minimal consensus, emphasizing that poorer nations had felt forced to accept suboptimal terms to prevent the conference's collapse. And Azerbaijan, a major oil and gas exporter, faced allegations of prioritizing fossil fuel interests over ambitious climate goals. Critics accused the hosts of rushing the final agreement through, marginalizing dissenting voices. That would often be called good management. The agreement highlighted inequities, with developed nations demanding contributions from emerging economies like China, but balking at increasing their own commitments. Meanwhile, developed nations face escalating climate crises with inadequate support. The UN climate chief Simon Stiel termed the deal an insurance policy for humanity, while cautioning that it depends on timely and complete funding. US President Joe Biden hailed the agreement as a historic outcome, but admitted it required significant follow-through. And the UK Energy Secretary Ed Miliband described it as a crucial 11th hour deal, acknowledging that it fell short of expectations but represented a necessary step. The German foreign minister defended the agreement as a starting point, insisting that Europe should meet its obligations and emphasizing the importance of trust. The agreement deepened rifts between wealthy and poor countries. Industrialized nations framed economic constraints and geopolitical instability, such as inflation and Putin and Netanyahu, as barriers to larger commitments. The emphasis on private sector funding raised concerns about the reliability and sufficiency of such contributions, given the urgency of climate change. The agreement occurred against a backdrop of rising right-wing backlash against climate policies in the EU, scepticism from leaders like Donald Trump, whose election victory loomed large over the negotiations, and the $300 billion figure contrasts starkly with the $1.3 trillion annual target considered necessary by experts, raising fears that critical 1.5 degrees centigrade warming thresholds will remain out of reach. While COP29 achieved a significant feat by stepping forward in setting a long-term climate finance target, the agreement was fraught with compromise and unmet expectations. Critics from India, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, among others, highlighted its inadequacy in addressing the enormity of the climate crisis, and the reliance on voluntary contributions and private financing underscores a persistent divide in global climate responsibility. As the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres remarked, this imperfect deal must serve as a foundation for more ambitious future efforts, beginning with COP30 in Brazil.